Okay, everyone. So last time just for those who just joined us, Deuteronomy, it's chapter 12. We're beginning with verse 17. That's chapter 12, verse 17. We're in the Eitz Chaim Chumash, if you have it, the bottom of page 1065, the last verse on page 1065. This is a continuation of what we saw last time. And this is a major theme of the book of Deuteronomy. And that is the centralization of worship in one place, in the place that God will choose, a place which we know is Jerusalem. So we saw that all other sanctuaries are now forbidden, and you have to go to Jerusalem to make your sacrifices. The whole ritual life of the people of Israel will revolve around Jerusalem.
Thank you.
It's generally believed that the book of Deuteronomy in general comes to light, or was perhaps written under the reign of King Josiah. That is to say, it's a very late biblical book, which the editor of the Torah put together with other much earlier material. And we know at least this about Josiah, that in the year 622, before the Common Era, he does a major reform. And part of that reform is to tear down all of the other altars and to purify the temple in Jerusalem, and to make that once again the only cultic site that is legitimate for the people. The story in Deuteronomy is that about Josiah, which we find in the book of Kings, the story about Josiah is that the temple was being repaired, and he found a book there, and read the book and repented for the people and enacted all of these reforms. And many scholars think that that was the book of Deuteronomy. And therefore date all of this centralization of the cult, to the time of Josiah, and specifically to around 622 before the Common Era. And it makes a certain amount of sense, as I mentioned last time, only because other biblical books suggest that there were many sites, even up through the time of King David, that God was not only worshipped in Jerusalem, but to give probably the most obvious example, there was a sanctuary in Shiloh, and that is where Hannah went to ask God to give her a child, and in fact she does, and that becomes the prophet Samuel, and so on. So this seems strange. I will say this, there was a time, of course, when there was a central sanctuary, and that goes all the way back to the wandering in the wilderness, right? Where you had the Mishkan, the portable sanctuary that they carried with them, and that was the only place, but there were no other possibilities there. So the question is, why? Why limit it? And as I mentioned last time, it's a real hardship, because people used to be able to go nearby, bring sacrifices nearby, fulfill their religious responsibilities in the communities in which they lived, or at least within a day's journey, right? So this makes God, as it were, much less accessible. And that's strange, because we do have this sense, not so much that God is everywhere, but that God should be and is accessible everywhere. You want to pray to God, you don't have to go to the temple. In modern times, you don't even have to go to the synagogue. Perhaps God is more accessible in these places, but still. So why centralize it all in one place and create what's really a hardship for the people? And there are a variety of theories. So I thought I would share 6 of them with you. The first is that what this text is actually intending to do is simply to limit sacrifice, to make fewer sacrifices. Maimonides in particular sees sacrifice as kind of an early stage of serving God. And we see in the prophets that they keep saying, well, God doesn't want your burnt offerings. What God wants is devotion and willingness. Not to say that the prophets were against sacrifice particularly, but sacrifice wasn't really the point. And so by centralizing things, and more importantly, by giving people the opportunity to eat meat outside of the temple, they really limit the number of sacrifices. Remember that in antiquity, prior to this, we get special regulations here, but prior to this, you wanted to have fleshik, you had to go to the temple, right? And as part of a sacrifice, a meal that you would share with God, you would get to eat meat. So that means lots of sacrifices, or more than you might otherwise think. So here we're going to cut down on the number of sacrifices. And in fact, the synagogue will eventually replace the temple. And there's some archaeological evidence that that happens even while the second temple is standing. So this, one could say that this is sort of a step along that path. A second way of looking at this is to say, this really makes the temple in Jerusalem unique. It strengthens its importance. It makes it a kind of central focus for the Jewish people, and that unites the people. Remember that various tribes are living in various places, and then by the time of Josiah, we have 2 kingdoms, right? The northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, right? The kingdom of Israel and Judea. And they face enemies. And the idea, it may be not just to emphasize Jerusalem, which is in the kingdom of Judea, but in fact, to unify the people in such a way that they will not be lured by Israel's enemies, particularly the Assyrians, who are the major enemy at the time of Josiah, perhaps to keep them from being lured away to join the Assyrians. There's another sense in which having multiple sanctuaries actually leads the Jewish people open to syncretism. That is, not to a strict monotheism, but to having cultic sites which begin to look like pagan sites, or perhaps places where not only is the God of Israel worshipped, but also other gods. It means there's less religious control over the nation as a whole. And you have these various temples, and who knows what could happen in those temples. And then there's a final idea, and that is you shouldn't do it simply because the pagans do it. They have lots of temples. You should not follow their ways, and therefore you should not have lots of temples. We see this idea elsewhere in Deuteronomy, and that is bechukotehem lo telechu, you should not walk in their ways. Don't do what they do. We have our own way of doing it. Since they have many cultic sites, we should not have many cultic sites. And this idea actually has been something that we see in the Jewish community, not just in ancient times, but in modern times. To give you one example, it used to be in the rabbinic period, early rabbinic period, certainly in the time of the temple, that Jews would prostrate themselves as part of their worship, right? They wouldn't just sort of bow, but they would kneel down before God, right? And we say it in Aleinu, actually, right? Anachnu mishtachavim, we bow down, umodim, and give acknowledgement or thanks to God. We stopped doing this, except for once a year on Yom Kippur. Why? Because it's what the Christians do, right? Even though we were doing it before, it became hukat hagoyim, the ways of the non-Jews, and therefore Jews stopped doing it. By the way, I think it runs both ways. Jews, of course, at least when we're praying, right, we cover our heads. Right? Why don't Christians, which Christianity came out of Judaism, why don't they cover their heads when they go to church? Well, that is their way, and we need to have our way. Also, the reason why they create their major observance on Sunday, right? They acknowledge that Shabbat is on Saturday, but their primary place, it's not that Sunday is somehow the Sabbath. Sunday is the Lord's Day, and that's where the focus is going to be. Right? So you can see that this idea that we don't do this because the pagans do it, even if we once did, we don't do it anymore, has a certain resonance and a certain sense to it. So I've given you essentially 6 different possibilities, and it may not be any of them, or it may be a combination of them, but it's very striking that we have this dramatic shift with all of its associated problems in order to centralize everything in the place where God has chosen to put God's name. I'm going to change the view just for a moment. And if you have any questions or comments about this major theme in the book of Deuteronomy, or any of the rationales, or if you think of others yourself that you want to share, I'll take a minute for that. Anything at all? If not, yes, Myra, please. Unmute.
Okay, stupid question. I noticed that priests and the Pope wear yarmulkes.
Yes. Yeah, someone once asked me about the Pope, and I said because he knows better. But that as it may, it's not just the Pope. It is also bishops who cover their right. And the Pope is actually, sort of an elevated bishop. He's known as the Bishop of Rome, right? So the answer is, I don't know, right? But remember that they have ecclesiastical garb, right? And part of that, they wear robes and other things, and it seems to be part of it, and they only do it during, the Pope does it all the time, so I don't know, I wouldn't say that, but the bottom line is, I don't know. I don't know why their vestments are the way they are, but it's certainly clear that ordinary church-going Christians are, and I don't know every denomination, but in general are expected to uncover their head. And I have been asked, actually going to a church, to take my hat off, which is an interesting dilemma, but since I think, one should show respect, and since I'm not going there to pray, I do it. I don't feel quite good about it, but given the choice, that's the choice I make. Any other? Sandy, go ahead.
So, Rabbi, there are, excuse me, discrepancies in the story between, I say, in Exodus and Deuteronomy, what Moses says. Is one of the reasons what you said because the book of Deuteronomy was found later?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there are theological reasons, but yes, I think, we have, whether it's earlier or later, and I think it is later. I find this idea very compelling, right? But either way, you could say it comes from a different source, right? If you're going to take the position, as modern scholars do, that what we have is a document which was put together that from different sources, then that explains often, but not always, contradictions. I have to say that, as I've mentioned before, I think one reason, however, for the contradictions, particularly in the section that we've looked at up till now, is that we have Moses's recounting of what happened, whereas in the book of Exodus, we have sort of a narration of what happened. And Moses is being polemical, right? Moses is giving the people a message which he hopes will carry them now into the new land, which he will not go into. And so a difference in emphasis, a different reading in his sermon, right, is to be expected to a certain degree. It's a different slant. So I think one can read it, even if you read it straightforward. I think there are reasons that you could say that there are differences.
Thank you.
Okay, anything else, Hannah?
Yeah, you would think that this change would bring the population closer to Jerusalem. Is that what
Yes, you
happened?
would, but
Yeah,
it doesn't.
Maybe
It
that was
doesn't.
one of the goals.
Right. I don't think so. I mean, I don't know. Right. There's no evidence that it happened at all. And once you tell them they can eat meat where they are, and they only need to go 3 times a year, right? It doesn't seem like a big incentive to move. Maybe some people did. Some people are still moving to Jerusalem, right? Okay. Anything else?
There was not weekly worship? It was just the
No, remember that we are not talking about Judaism as we know it. Temple Judaism is about sacrifice. It's not about prayer, right? Individuals would pray, it's clear, but the idea of formal communal prayer really doesn't exist. It's not what the Levites are singing psalms in the temple. Somebody may pray to God, please, give me a child or heal him or something. But that's not organized religion, to use a certain term, right? So no, I don't think that in itself is problematic. I mean, it is problematic in the sense that people are now disconnected from this place where, to use the language of Deuteronomy, God causes God's name to dwell. That there is a connection in that place. It's a holy place. Not like what we saw in the book of Numbers, where there's a sense that God is, or even in Exodus, that God is actually there in the temple. It's not saying that. God is in the book of Deuteronomy in heaven, right? But God, there's a place to which you can go and God's presence will be felt. In the book of Exodus, God's presence fills it. There's a physicality to it. Here, I don't think there's a physicality in that way. Okay, if nothing else, let me switch back the view. Okay, so let's pick up with verse 17. It's page 165, chapter 12. You may not partake in your settlements of the tithes of your new grain or wine or oil. These are the first fruits, new wine or grain, and in a certain sense, they belong to God. You can't eat them where you are, or the firstlings of your herds or flocks, or of any of the votive offerings that you vow. Votive offerings are when you make a vow where you say, if this happens, then I will give this to the temple, right? In gratitude, right? That's a vow. So that's a votive offering. Free will offerings are things like I had a child, and I it's a little bit like I had a child, so I'm throwing a kiddush. There's a sense of gratitude which leads to a free will offering, and then contributions which are made. So those you must consume before the Lord your God in the place that the Lord your God will choose. You, your sons, your daughters, your male and female slaves, the Levite in your settlements, happy before the Lord your God in all your undertakings, right? You're going to go to Jerusalem and you're going to eat it there. And don't neglect the Levite as long as you live in the land. The Levite, of course, has no land of their own. And so they don't have of their own all of these things to bring to Jerusalem and to rejoice with. You have to take care of that for them. I want to take note of male and female slaves. This is part of the Torah's view that slaves are members of the household, that they, when you rejoice, they rejoice. Having said that, now I have a plug for you. Having said that, as part of my podcast, actually the next one that we record, we just did one on Israel. Happy Yom Ha'atzmaut, by the way. We just did one on Israel. And the next one, I'll be discussing with my podcast partner, who, as you know, is an Episcopal priest, slavery in the Bible, and by the way, in the Christian Bible, and what we do with it. How do we deal with it? We're doing this actually live at his church on the 3rd, and then at the synagogue I belong to, again, live 2 weeks later on the 17th. And but we will be recording it and we will be issuing it as part of our podcast. The first one is, how do we look at slavery? And the second one is the whole question of reparations, how we deal with the fact that this country was built in part by the labor of enslaved people. So that's a plug, but in the Torah here, we generally see that these people, probably indentured servants, they become your servants because you pay off a debt, for example, they are treated as members of your household. Okay, moving on. When the Lord your God enlarges your territory as he's promised you, and you say, I shall have some meat, for you have the urge to eat meat, you may eat meat whenever you wish, right? You don't have to wait for a sacrifice. You don't have to go to Jerusalem. If the place the Lord has chosen to establish his name is too far from you, you may slaughter any of the cattle or sheep that the Lord gives you, as I have instructed you, and you may eat to your heart's content in your settlements. Eat, however, as the gazelle and deer are eaten. The impure may eat it together with the pure, that is, those who are ritually impure, not the animal. You can't eat the impure animals like a pig. But if you're not in a state of ritual purity, which you would have to be to go to the temple and make a sacrifice, you can still eat it. And then we get a very strong statement. But make sure you do not partake of the blood, for the blood is the life, and you must not consume the life with the flesh. You must not partake of it. You must pour it out on the ground like water. You must not partake of it, in order that will go well with you and your descendants to come, for you will be doing what is right in the sight of the Lord. So notice the strong emphasis here. Don't do it. You must not do it. Don't do it, right? You can eat meat, but make sure you don't eat the blood. And the idea is, we're gonna see, I think, let me see if it comes yet. No, it doesn't, right? But the idea is that the blood really is the life. Well, do not consume the life of the flesh. Yeah, it does say it, right? This is the life, and you can't take the life of the animal. You can only eat the meat. And this means that the same kinds of regulations which applied in the temple in Jerusalem now apply to eating meat outside the temple. You used to only be able to eat it there, and then you had sacrificial slaughter, and there were particular rules. Now you're going to eat it at home, and there are particular rules which are the same. And that has to do, a lot of it has to do with blood, right? So how an animal, how the shochet, the animal, how the ritual slaughter kills it so that you can eat it is in a very particular way. You have to sever main arteries so that the blood will pour out. And then the meat is soaked and salted in order to purge it of as much blood as possible. Now, what do you do with it? What do you do with the blood? You can't eat it, so you pour it onto the ground. But if you go to the temple, you shall offer the burnt offerings, both the flesh and the blood on the altar, and the blood shall be poured out on the altar of the Lord your God, and you should eat the flesh, right? Either way, you don't eat it, but if you're in Jerusalem, it becomes part of the ritual, and if you're not in Jerusalem, you simply pour it into the ground. And there are those who have argued that this is in part a way of moving the people closer to vegetarianism. There is a sense that from the point of view of the Bible, at least from the point of view of the early chapters of Genesis, human beings really, if you look in the Garden of Eden, they're not given permission to eat meat. They're supposed to be in this. They can eat all of the vegetarians, all of the vegetables. I guess they're supposed to be vegans in that sense, right? And then after the flood, God sees human nature for what it is, and God says, okay, you can eat meat, but again, as here, not the blood. Okay, be careful to heed the commandments, and it will go well with you and your descendants, and you will be doing what is right and good, hatov v'hayashar, in the eyes of God. And now we have a concern about idolatry and some specific concerns. When the Lord your God has cut down before you the nations that you're about to enter and dispossess, and you have dispossessed, beware of being lured into their ways after they've been wiped out before you. Do not inquire about their gods, saying, how did these nations worship their gods? I too will follow these practices. You shall not act towards the Lord your God as they perform for their gods every abhorrent act that the Lord detests. They even offer their sons and daughters in fire to their gods. So this idea of offering their children in fire is viewed by many as child sacrifice. And particularly it seems that the pagan god Moloch, was worshipped by, the language is here, it's yisrafu ba'esh, you burn them in fire. Elsewhere, it is pass them through fire. And there are scholars who think that this is really not child sacrifice, but that this is simply a way of, if you're going to give your child over to the service of the god, there's a ritual which involves fire, perhaps walking through a path where there's fire on either side of you. That would be like passing through fire. Unclear. It seems more likely from the language here, where it says burned in fire, that it does look like some kind of pagan sacrifice. And I think here the emphasis is, this is how bad they are. Right? This is, don't be lured into their practices. They're horrific. They're an abomination. And now we get some material which is more difficult. If there appears among you a prophet or a dream diviner, it's a cholem chalom, a dreamer of dreams, and he gives you a sign or a portent, saying, let us follow and worship other gods who you have not experienced, even if the sign or portent that he names come true, right? So this is a false, what we would call a false prophet. But what's interesting here is he still is able to do the magic. Right? He is able to make a prediction about something or do some magical act, which happens. And so you might be inclined to follow him. But if he's asking you to follow another god, he's not a real prophet. He's a false, or what's called a navi sheker, a lying prophet, right? So the test is not miracles. And I want to emphasize that also in terms of Christianity. Right? The idea, it's very important in Christianity in terms of establishing the divinity of Jesus to talk about the miracles. Miracles which are actually modeled after things that were done by Elijah and Elisha. But that in itself doesn't, unless you're telling the people what God wants you to tell them, you're a false prophet, even if you can do the kinds of things that Moses did in order to prove that God had sent him. Okay. So why? How could this be possible that this person could do this? God is testing you to see whether you love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul. Follow none but the Lord your God, revere none but him, observe his commandments alone, heed his orders, worship none but him, and hold fast. So it's a test. That's how we should. Why does God allow it? God is testing our faith, our loyalty. And this is an image of God that we do see earlier in the Bible. We see, in the time of Abraham, for example, that God tests him a number of times. Leave your land, go where I'll show you. Is he willing to do it? This one can't be your heir, that one, only Sarah, the son you have with Sarah, can be your heir. Moses and Abraham accepts it, and finally this test of his own son. So God is testing you. This is part of what God does to verify your loyalty, and if you pass the test. There is in this argument something that we see today among creationists, these very fundamentalist readings of the Bible, who are confronted with the fossils of dinosaurs. Right? So what do they say? Well, either they try to fit it into the timeline, or they just say it's a test. God put these bones in the ground to test you, right? So on one hand, you'd say, well, it's preposterous. But on the other hand, well, here we have the false prophet and the people are. So what do you do with this? You don't listen. And as for the prophet or the dream diviner, he should be put to death. He urged disloyalty to the Lord your God who freed you out of Egypt to make you stray from the path that the Lord commanded you, and therefore you will purge this evil from your midst. Okay, got it. Now it gets a little worse, or a little more difficult. If your brother, your own mother's son, or your son or daughter, or the wife of your bosom, or your closest friend entices you in secret, saying, come, let us worship other gods, who neither you nor your ancestors have experienced from among the gods of the peoples around you, neither you nor distant anywhere from one end of the earth to the other, do not assent or give heed. And here we go, show him no pity or compassion. Don't shield him. Take his life. Let your hand be the first against him to put him to death, and the hand of the rest of the people thereafter. Stone him to death, for he sought to make you stray from the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, the house of bondage. Thus Israel will hear and be afraid, and such evil things will not be done. Right? So, kill your child, kill your sibling. This is, in a sense, what the book of Deuteronomy says. God is demanding, because otherwise everything will fall apart. And as difficult as this is, you can't allow this person, even your family member, to lead people astray. Now we come to yet another example of this, which is even more difficult, and I want to focus on that for a minute. If you hear it said of one of the towns that the Lord your God is giving you to dwell in, that some scoundrels from among you have gone and subverted the inhabitants of that town, saying, come, let us worship other gods who you not experienced, you shall investigate and inquire and interrogate thoroughly, right? So you really have to go through a very serious process. If it's true, the fact is established that the abhorrent thing was perpetuated in your midst, put the inhabitants of the town to the sword, put its cattle to the sword, doom it and all that is in it to destruction, gather its spoil in the open square, burn the town and its spoil as a holocaust to the Lord your God, and it shall remain in everlasting ruin, never to be rebuilt. Let nothing that has been doomed stick to your hand, in order that the Lord may turn his blazing anger and show you compassion, and in his compassion increase you as he promised your ancestors on earth, for you will be heeding the Lord your God, obeying God's commandments that I enjoin you this day, doing what is right. So, not only are you now going to kill a family member, but you're going to exterminate an entire city. Well, I have to say the rabbis have a lot of trouble with this. They don't like this law. And so I want to share my screen with you now. Yes, okay, I hope everybody can see this. The Gemara raises a question. In accordance with whose opinion is it taught in a Breita? A Breita is a rabbinic teaching considered to be authoritative. There has never been an idolatrous city, and there will never be one in the future, right? So here the rabbi saying, yeah, it's in the Torah, yeah, but never happens, right? And probably because you should investigate and inquire and, really get down to it. And in that process, you will find a way not to find this synagogue guilty. And why was the passage of the idolatrous city written in the Torah? So that you may expound upon new understandings of the Torah and receive reward for your learning. It's there so you can study it. And from study, God will reward you. Not from doing this, but through Torah study, God will reward you. In accordance with whose opinion this is, it's the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, who taught in a Braita. Rabbi Eliezer says, any city that has even one mezuzah or any other sacred scroll cannot become an idolatrous city. It's difficult to imagine an entire city without one mezuzah, right? So surely there had, by the way, it could still be on the house, right? Even though the whole city has come over to paganism. You know, it just got left there. Why? And now we're going to see the reason. The Gemara asks, what is the reason that a city that has even one mezuzah cannot become an idolatrous city? And the answer is the verse that we just looked at. The verse says, you shall gather all the spoil of it in the midst of the open space of the city and burn it with fire, both the city and the plunder. And since if there is a mezuzah, it is impossible to burn all the contents of the city, as it is written, you should overthrow their altars, burn their with fire. Thus, this you should not do to the Lord your God. It is derived from this verse that it is prohibited to destroy a sacred item such as a mezuzah. Right? See, the problem is that you'd have to burn it, and you're not allowed to burn a mezuzah. So done. Can't happen, right? It's very clever. This is typical of the rabbis. They can't just say, well, no, it's in the Torah, but we're not going to do it. First, they have to say, well, if we're not going to do it, why is it in the Torah? Okay, it's in the Torah because we're going to study it. Okay. But really, why shouldn't we do it? And by the way, they're not going to say, well, because it's an abomination. How can you put an entire city to death? They're not going to say that because it's in the Torah, and the Torah seems to be suggesting it. So they can't just say, well, the Torah is immoral. They're not going to say that. So they say they have a technical reason, right, having to do with the mezuzah. It's very clever, I think. And it's this same debate also goes, it has to do with the stubborn and rebellious child, which the Torah says should be put to death. And we get the same statement there. There never was and never will be a stubborn and rebellious child. And then we have Rabbi Yonatan, who has to chime in here, and he says, nope. I once saw an idolatrous city that was condemned to destruction, and I sat on its ruins. Since Rabbi Yonatan is living in the 2nd century after the destruction of the temple, it's impossible to say that he saw this. It's just not the word. Even if this law was being carried out, it couldn't have been carried out in his lifetime. But what he's afraid, I think, and here I'm reading into this, I think he's afraid that if we say, well, it never was and never will be, then the deterrent effect will not be there. So he wants to maintain a sense of well, the Torah says that the entire thing would be burned, and I saw it happen, so you better be very careful, right? I think that's what's going on here, because it just doesn't, I don't understand how he could have, given when he lived. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm actually going to open the view. And questions or comments on this material, on the false prophet, or the idolatrous city, or anything else that we haven't talked about. Anybody? Yeah, Barry, go ahead.
Yes, I wonder if there's any archaeological evidence of.
No, there's no archaeological evidence. Well, so to be fair, there is archaeological evidence of cities in the land of Israel that were destroyed. But the assumption of archaeologists is they were destroyed by, enemies. in either they were destroyed because they actually had pagans living in them and they're destroyed in the time of Joshua, although archaeologists are very, divided about how true the stories in Joshua are historically, or when enemies came and conquered the land, they destroyed cities. But so you can't interpret from the fact, you can't assume if you see a destroyed city that it was for this reason. I can't imagine an archaeologist therefore claiming.
No,
Yeah, go ahead, Barry, finish
no,
up.
we are, so God destroys Sodom and Gomorrah.
Yes,
And-
so
and-
God
and-
destroys
and-
Sodom and
and
Gomorrah, yes.
Destroys
okay.
even though there are some righteous
Right. And Sodom
people
and
living
Gomorrah,
in the
right,
city.
this is, by the way, these are not Israelites, not Jews killing other Jews, and it's not Jews killing anyone. Sodom and Gomorrah, right, are destroyed by God, and Abraham doesn't like it, right, and argues, even if there are 10 righteous people, that God should leave the city alone, right? So we already have a sense God is doing it. God has the bigger picture, and they had to all really, really be evil, all of them, for this to be justified. Other questions, comments, Sandy?
So, Rabbi, is there a baraita for the brother that is idolatrous?
So I don't know that. I'm not aware of one. I can do a search, but I'm not aware of one.
I mean, you would think that if that there's all the things you said about the rebellious child,
Yes.
and
Right.
that they would protect their own family.
Right. So yeah, the question is, I agree, it's problematic. It's less problematic, right? This is a person who is individually guilty. It's hard to imagine that an entire city is completely filled with people who are idolatrous, right? So there's a different level to it, but I certainly take your point.
Can I?
yeah.
Let someone else go ahead.
Okay, anything else? Yeah.
Well, I was going to ask, but I don't know if someone else wants to ask first.
Okay, who was it that had a hand up? I don't see any other hands, so.
Okay, so how does someone determine if it's a false prophet or not?
Right, so it's about the prophet's message. It's not about what the prophet does. It's not about being able to predict the future. It's not about being able to do something that seems supernatural. It's only about the message. And if the message encourages people to abandon God, false prophet. It's that simple.
So are you saying to abandon what God's laws or rules or
well,
what's in the Torah?
here it's to be idolatrous, right? That's in the book of Deuteronomy. Now, there's other literature which suggests, yes, if the prophet tells people to abandon something specific, that's also problematic. But here it's simply about abandoning God completely and worshiping another God. Yeah.
So this has always bothered me that when God told Abraham, to kill his son, I mean, that's violating the law. And so it looks like Abraham's like doing what a false prophet would say to do. He's following it at least.
Yeah, but God makes it clear he didn't want him to do it.
Yeah, but in the beginning.
Yes. So here Abraham shows his loyalty to God and his willingness to, in the face of this test. Although, I don't think that Abraham was ever meant to, and I think Abraham was meant to realize that he wasn't meant to, and he needs some prodding from an angel to see that he wasn't meant to. So I think there, I don't think that really has to do with this. I'll just leave it there. Barry, you had your hand up.
Yes, so there are atheists in the world, so would an atheist and someone who argues for atheism be considered a false prophet?
No, I don't. Well, I mean, in ancient times, there are no atheists.
Right,
Right?
yeah,
So in a sense, we're talking about a phenomena different than this. From the point of view of the sort of the Jewish law, you know, it's more about behavior than belief. You know, if you look at the Ten Commandments, I am the Lord your God who led you out of the land of Egypt to be your God, is understood by some as being commanded to, you know, to believe in God. But others don't see it that way. It's very hard. Maimonides is very big on believing in God. You have to believe in God. But other parts of the tradition don't seem to put that much emphasis on it. Remember also that Judaism is only worried about Jews. And here too, other people can worship whatever they want, however they want. They can believe in another God, no God. It's not a concern. And again and again. A friend of mine just said, he was actually teaching a group of Christians who asked him, you know, why aren't Jews out trying to, if you believe in your message, why aren't you spreading the good news? And my friend said, well, he said, we're not imperialistic like you are. Right? That the idea that everybody has to be like you, that's not our idea. So, I mean, it's an interesting question what to make of atheism, and but it does not seem to be, it certainly doesn't exist in the world of Deuteronomy. Everybody follows some God. That seems to be the assumption. Whether there were people who didn't, I have no idea, but certainly not large numbers. Okay, anything else? We're about to wrap up here. I look for, yes, no, okay. So I look forward to seeing you all next week, where we are going to look a little bit about how the dead are to be mourned, among other things. Should be interesting. And until then, I'll see you next Tuesday. I'm about to, stop the recording, and we'll be sending it out if you want to listen again. Anyway, have a great week, and I'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye.
Rabbi.